mostly about oral cancers and about laryngeal cancers. But oropharynx is such an important topic. Incidence-wise, it is very high, and there is hardly any head and neck conference that you attend where they don't have sessions upon sessions on oropharynx, mainly because of the HPV thing. So today, Dr. Manu is going to present a case of cancer of the tonsil. I don't know whether he's also got another one for base of the tongue. But I thought that it is very important for us to have you here today. And there are two topics that I am always looking up to you for. One is for cancer of the oropharynx, and the other is for skull-based tumors. And today I think we've kept a case on squamous cancer of the tonsil, and we'll have Manu present that. And I want you to have a free hand and examine him on all aspects and educate us. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, sir. It's my pleasure to be here.
Kannan will be joining very soon. He's still busy in the theatre, but he'll come very soon. And Dr. Prathamesh Pai is not able to come today, or he might join later on, I don't know.
Sure, sir.
So Manu, can we start?
Yes, sir.
And be loud better. Be loud, please.
The patient is Ashok Maurya, a 36-year-old gentleman. He works at a pawn shop. He's a resident of Kurla, Mumbai. He came with the chief complaints of pain on the right side of throat since the last 1 month. He was apparently all right. He was apparently all right 1 month back when he noticed pain over the right side of throat, which was a dull aching pain, insidious in onset, present intermittently for the last 1 month. There was no progression in intensity as such. It was aggravated by swallowing solids from the right side of throats, not relieved completely by taking oral pain medications, and it was radiating to the right ear. There is no history of any difficulty in swallowing, difficulty in breathing, change in voice, chronic cough, any foreign body sensation in throat, throat clearing, loss of appetite or significant weight loss, any constitutional symptoms, noticing any obvious neck swelling, and any history suggestive of distant meds, such as bone pains or abdominal pains or chronic history of vomiting or weight loss. Past history. There's no history of COX or COX contact, diabetes mellitus, hypertension, bronchial asthma, emphysema, ischemic heart disease, any surgical interventions done in the past, or any known allergies. Personal history. Patient is on a vegetarian diet.
Before we start personal history, based on the history of the present illness, can you tell me how would you localize the site of this patient? If you had to, with just this history, give a site predilection, how would you classify this as?
Ma'am, he's complaining of pain on the right side of the throat since the last 1 month, which is radiating to the right ear and aggravated by swallowing solids on the right side. So, which is present intermittently, and there was no progression in intensity. So my site would be on the right side, mostly the tonsil, the site of the oropharynx, that is the base of tongue, vallecula, the tonsil on the right side of the lateral pharyngeal wall, could be portion of the supraglottis, also involving the epiglottis or the lateral or the posterior pharyngeal wall on the right side.
So how common is it for oropharyngeal cancers to present as pain?
It is usually unlikely for oropharyngeal cancers to present as pain. Usually they present with a neck swelling. But
what are other features in this history which you would suggest that this is a patient who has oropharyngeal cancer compared to a hypopharyngeal cancer, which is more likely to have pain radiating to the right ear?
There is no history of any foreign body sensation in throat or throat clearing, which are usually seen, or history suggestive of chronic cough due to repeated aspirations. which are seen in hypopharyngeal cancers, and there's no history of difficulty in swallowing and difficulty in breathing, which further corresponds to negates any history suggestive of hypopharyngeal cancer.
What would be the change in voice associated with oropharyngeal cancers?
The change in voice is usually a hot potato voice, kind of a voice in which there is the loss of when speaking, loss of inability to speak consonants.
Okay. So it's a muffled voice, which appears as if the patient is talking with something within his throat. So that would be a more common presentation when you think of a oropharyngeal cancer, compared to just a pain in the throat, which can be more likely to be a supraglottic or a hypopharyngeal cancer, especially when it's radiating to the neck. What is the relation of pain? Can you classify where the pain, the radiation of the pain, can you classify the subset of cancer depending on the radiation of pain in head neck cancers?
Ma'am, in head neck cancers, if the lesion is in the pain usually radiates to the ears in case of the base of tongue cancers or alveolar cancers or anterior 2/3 of tongue cancers. The nerve supply is a major agent which could be irritative or could be involved. In the anterior 2/3, the lingual nerve is involved, which and the posterior 1/3 and the base of tongue, the glossopharyngeal nerve, which supplies the tympanic plexus part of the middle ear and inner surface of the tympanic membrane, so it is radiated to the ear. And the part of the alveolus and the lingual nerve, which when it is involved, because of the involvement of the trigeminal nerve, it is auriculotemporal branch of trigeminal nerve supplies the external ear, the anterior part of the external auditory canal, and the lateral part of the pinna.
So excellent. If you have lesions which are more anterior, they will through the auriculotemporal nerve, the pain will be radiating more in the external auditory canal. Whereas base tongue lesions or supraglottic lesions through the Jacobson's plexus via the pharyngeal plexus will cause a deep-seated pain. So if you say these specific words that the patient has no deep-seated pain, you're ruling out something which is more posterior-based lesion. If you just excuse me, I just need to come back in a minute, sir.
Okay, okay. I think this distinction is very important, Manu.
Yes, sir.
The localization of where the discomfort is.
Yes, sir.
The point that Dr. Nair has pointed out is a very significant difference.
Yes, sir.
Do any of the students have any questions to ask Manu? Any of the postgraduates have any questions or comments?
Sorry about that, sir. Children at home.
Okay. Continue.
Anu, you talked about difficulty in breathing. What difficulty do you expect in an oropharyngeal cancer? How would you classify difficulty in breathing for an oropharyngeal versus a supraglottic or laryngeal cancer?
In oropharyngeal cancers, if it is a tonsillar or base of tongue CA which is obstructing the airway, the oropharyngeal airway, it may cause difficulty in breathing. But if it is much lower down, in the hypopharynx or the larynx, it would cause a noisy breathing because of the involvement of the airway proper, leading to stridor.
Yeah, so both are noisy breathing, but the lower airway you're calling it stridor, whereas the upper airway is called stertor. Okay, how do you differentiate between a stridor or a stertor?
Ma'am, if the patient is told to breathe through the nose and the stutter, if the patient is told to breathe through the nose, the stutter may disappear, or but the stridor won't. If the patient is told to close his mouth and told to breathe through the nose only, the stutter may disappear.
Yeah, so stutter is more noisy breathing, but with when he opens the mouth and puts out his tongue, there may be some opening of the airway, so your stutter will reduce or the noisy breathing will reduce. Whereas in stridor, you will have accessory muscles of respiration being used. So that is one of the ways to differentiate whether it's an upper airway obstruction or a lower down airway obstruction. So you should, especially in oropharyngeal growths, you should be able to differentiate both of the same.
Yes, sir.
I think you can, you've talked about no history of distant metastasis and such history of bone pains, abdominal pain, loss of weight. What is the most common, is knowing that this is oropharynx primary, what is the most common site of metastasis you expect in these patients?
The most common site of oropharyngeal squamous cell carcinomas as such is lungs, followed by liver and bones.
Liver and bones? What's the incidence of liver metastasis in any head neck cancers?
Well, it is less compared to it is very less. The most common site is the lungs.
So around 50% of distant metastasis would be lungs, followed by bones, which would be 30%, and less than 20% will be abdominal other metastasis. So liver mets is quite rare in head and neck cancers, it's squamous cell carcinomas especially. So when you give your differentials or you're giving your negative history, talk about the sites which are more commonly expected to be metastasized to. Dr. Pradhan, do you have any other things you think we need to add in the history?
No, I'm just enjoying you.
So I think you can move on to personal history.
Yeah.
The patient is on a vegetarian diet. Bladder bowel habits are normal. Sleep appetite is normal. He's unmarried. Denies any high-risk behavior. He has a history of tobacco chewing for the last 20 years. Started at the age of 16 years. Started with chewing gutka. Now for the last 10 years, progressed to kheni and pan. Keeps on the bilateral gingiva buccal sulcus alternatively, and chews 4 to 5 packets of gutka or kheni per day, and chews 2 to 3 pan per day. There is history of cigarette smoking for the last 5 years, 5 pack years, and occasional alcohol consumptions in the last 5 years.
So what is the significance of what do you define by high-risk sexual behavior?
Ma'am, history of multiple sexual partners or history of oral sex is a high-risk behavior for HPV positive oropharyngeal squamous cell carcinomas.
Do you have any idea of the number of partners which is classified as a high-risk behavior, or the number of partners which are purported in studies to cause HPV-related oropharyngeal cancers?
No, ma'am.
Well, I'm not very sure, but I think it's something to 16 to 20 partners, but you'll need to read it up. I'm not exactly sure of the numbers. Okay. What is the relevance of tobacco history when you're talking about oropharyngeal cancers?
History of tobacco use is associated with increased risk of oral cavity and oropharyngeal cancers. The substances used in tobacco, like this betel nuts and lime and aricolin, cause increased risk of cancers in the oral cavity and oropharynx. And if you have history of tobacco use for a long duration of years, the chances of HPV infection also increases.
How is HPV and tobacco related?
Ma'am, tobacco also causes mutations in P53 and multiple mutations in the genes of the body, and HPV also causes downregulation of the P53 and PRB genes.
Are the pathways the same for HPV and tobacco carcinogenesis?
No, ma'am. The pathways are different. but the genes involved, multiple genes involved in tobacco causes a predisposition for HPV infection because of.
So how does HPV contribute? What is HPV carcinogenesis? You said P53. HPV works on P53, but what does it do? Does it mutate it?
It does not mutate it. It causes the downregulation of the genes.
Causes a suppression of the gene, right?
Suppression of the genes.
So how does it do that? By
HPV, it's a circular. It has a circular DNA with some early proteins and late proteins. There are E1, E3, E5, and E6, E7s. E6 and E7 are most important in the pathogenesis, and some late proteins like L1 and L2. So the E6 and E6 causes specific downregulation of P53, and E7 causes downregulation of PRB, the retinoblastoma gene, and these causes the changes in these P53 and PRB are regulators of apoptosis or cellular multiplication and replication. So when it is downregulated, the multiplication and replication increases, and there is uncontrolled the proliferation of cells.
So what is the main difference between a HPV-associated oropharyngeal cancer versus a tobacco-associated oropharyngeal cancer?
Tobacco-associated oropharyngeal cancers causes a mutation in P53, whereas this only with respect to the etiology.
Etiology, prognosis. So basically carcinogenesis as well as etiology.
Ma'am, in a HPV-associated oropharyngeal cancers usually affects young age individuals.
We'll talk about clinical behavior later. Let's talk about basically the carcinogenesis. How do they vary? You said one is working on the E6 and E7 proteins, whereas in tobacco it's causing a mutation of the P53 gene. So how does this carcinogenesis vary in both of them?
The mutation of the P53 gene causes uncontrolled cellular proliferation, and there are multiple mutations because of tobacco. In the mutations in EGFR and cyclins, which also causes uncontrolled proliferations, and there is loss of cell cycle regulation.
So what happens?
The regulation for proliferation is lost because of the mutations in P53.
So again, now that's at molecular level. So at a morphological level, what happens to the patients? How do these patients present?
A patient of non-HPV oropharyngeal cancer will present with a primary which is with ulcer proliferative lesion in the oropharynx or oral cavities, which is associated with tobacco, and with neck nodes in the later stages. But in case of HPV positive, they usually have early mets or which are usually cystic.
Okay. I wanted to know more about in terms of the exposure to the whole upper aerodigestive tract. So the chances of synchronous and multiple primaries are more likely to be in
tobacco abuse.
Why?
Because of field cancerization, it causes multiple changes in the aerodigestive tract. So it is more common in tobacco abuse rather than HPV positive.
So can you tell me why, who brought about this concept of field cancerization and what exactly it means?
It was proposed by Slaughter, who said that in cases of abuse with carcinogenesis, the changes in body, which happens in molecular level, happens in multiple areas of the aerodigestive tract mucosa. So this is the reason for patients presenting with multiple primaries or second primaries or synchronous or metaconus carcinomas.
Whereas in HPV, what happens?
In HPV, the mutations are at a molecular level and there is no field cancerization.
Again, so there are no mutations per se. It's more of a tumor the genes are suppressed.
Yes, ma'am.
So you won't see molecular-based significant mutations. It's more suppression of the genes And that's why you don't see multiple synchronous primaries in these patients.
Yes,
In most of them, there's a site predilection. Why is there a site predilection for HPV? And which is the site predilection?
It happens at the zones of transitions from the mucosa, it was proposed earlier in the cervical cancers where there is change in mucosa from the squamous epithelium to the pseudostratified or ciliated columnar epithelium in the cervix. Likewise, there is the Walde's ring where the mucosa changes from the normal mucosa of the squamous epithelium to the stratified squamous epithelium. These transitional zones are prone for HPV infections.
Excellent. So basically, the most common site of predilection is the tonsillar crypts, like you rightly said, and the Walde's rings, and that's why you see most of the HPV-related cancers being related to the oropharynx, though you have HPV-related cancers even of the larynx, the and other sites, but the incidence is lower. Which is the high-risk HPV which are related to oropharyngeal cancers?
HPV 16 and 18 are 16 more than 18 are predisposed for oropharyngeal cancers.
Excellent. And what are the other HPVs associated with head neck cancer, head neck tumors?
HPV 611 for papillomatous growth of the larynx.
Great. What else?
Then there are low risk HPV like 31, 33, and 35.
CNN? What about anogenital warts?
So these are 31, 33, 35.
So the HPV anogenital warts will be seen in that. And the oropharyngeal will be the 6N. Or you were saying something?
No, ma'am, sorry.
Okay, excellent. So I think most of the personal history is covered. What is the additive effect of alcohol to tobacco? Is it synergistic? It is additive? It is separate?
Ma'am, it is additive for, it is synergistic for oral cavity, additive for oropharynx and supraglottis, and multiplicative for the larynx.
What do you mean by each of them?
As such, like if for oropharynx, since the oral cavity and oropharynx, since the alcohol can act as a solvent for the tobacco and these carcinogenesis, it causes a synergistic action that if synergistic additive, as in like if you add up the individual risks together, they'll be adding up in oral cavity in oropharynx, and the individual risks will be multiplicative in the larynx.
So basically in oropharynx you have, if the risk is 5% in with tobacco and it's 3%, it becomes 8%. In synergistic, there are more molecular level changes happening, so the risk will be higher and multiplicative as indicated. Okay, great, excellent. Which is can you just tell me, since we are just discussing HPV, what is the incidence of HPV related oropharyngeal cancers in different areas of the world? Would you have an approximate idea? And India?
HPV related oropharyngeal cancers, the chance of HPV infections and HPV related oropharyngeal cancers are seen most commonly in the Western countries. But the recent studies have shown that prevalence is between 15 to 78% in the Indian subcontinent.
15 to 78%. 78% is which?
Varies between 15 to 75 or 78%.
Which data are you quoting for 78% in oropharyngeal cancer in India?
Murthy, but Tata Medical, the Tata Hospital study by Murthy, and one study by the prevalence score.
So oropharynx is not HPV related oropharyngeal cancers are between 15 to 40%, 50% in one for oral cavity in a study by the Mazumdar-Shaw group. But the Tata Hospital data from Vedang Murthy et al. Showed that the maximum incidence is in tonsillar cancer, which is around 28%. So around 30% of cancers, but on an average, only 20% of oropharyngeal cancers in India are HPV related. Compared to the Western world, Americas have around a 45 to 50% and upwards range compared to Scandinavian countries, which has a range of upwards of 70% of the cancers are HPV related. What about France?
Sorry, ma'am, I don't know.
So France again has a lot of smokeless tobacco and alcohol. So their incidence of HPV related oropharyngeal cancers are lower. They have more incidence of tobacco related cancer. So it's very interesting when you see the world map at different sites. Okay, I think we've covered quite well about the history and basic personal history. One thing what you missed in your present history is history of nasal regurgitation. Why is it important to talk about nasal regurgitation in these patients?
The lesion in the oropharynx involving the soft palate or the palate as such will lead to decreased mobility of the palate and it may cause nasal regurgitation.
So is there any clinical implication of this? Well, if it is involving the palate, it is upstaging the hard palate. It is upstaging the tumor to a T4A. Does hard palate involvement cause nasal regurgitation? So it's soft palate involvement. Soft palate is still?
Like depending upon the tumor size.
Okay. Clinical implication would be that if the patient already has nasal regurgitation and soft palate is involved, you may not consider upfront surgical modality because that will worsen the patient's symptoms. You know that you would have to resect the soft palate and that will worsen the patient's symptoms. So that may be a clinical implication when you're taking history. Okay, I think move on to your examination.
The general examination, patient is alert, conscious, cooperative, sitting comfortably in a chair, is thinly built but well nourished. ECOG is 0, 22 on BMI. BP is 116/86 millimeters of mercury on right arm in sitting position. Pulse is 68 beats per minute, right radial artery. Respiratory rate is 18 per minute. On local examination, there is bilateral angular cheilitis present. The lips appear to be fissured. Oral cavity on inspection, the mouth opening was reduced, 2 fingers. Teeth were 32 present, but caries were present. The alveoli were normal. Oral hygiene was poor. Buccal mucosa showed melanophakic patches. And gingivo-labial, gingivo-buccal, gingivo-lingual sulci were normal. Tongue was normal. Hard palate was normal. On inspection of the oropharynx, the base of the tongue appeared to be normal. The anterior pillar, there was a right side unhealthy mucosa over the upper part of the anterior pillar, reaching up to the soft palate of approximate size 1 centimeters. The left anterior pillar was normal. On the tonsils on the right side was enlarged compared to the left side. There was irregular growth seen involving the right tonsil reaching anteriorly the anterior pillar and posteriorly the posterior pillar, inferiorly up till the right pharyngoepiglottic fold and base of tongue, but not involving it. The left tonsil was normal. On palpation of the oral cavity, there was oral submucous fibrosis bands in the buccal mucosa on both sides. Lips, alveolus, gingivo-labial, gingivo-buccal, and labiolingual sulcus, and anterior 2/3 of the tongue and floor of mouth were normal. On palpation of the oropharynx, there was an indurated ulceroproliferative irregular tonsillar swelling on the right side, reaching superiorly to the soft palate, anteriorly reaching the anterior pillar. No induration over the anterior pillar was palpated, and posteriorly reaching up till the posterior pillar. Posterior pillar induration was seen only was palpated only inferiorly, and the lesion was inferiorly involving the lateral third of the lateral pharyngoepiglottic fold, and base of tongue was not indurated. It measured approximately 2.5 centimeters superior inferiorly and 2 centimeters anterior posteriorly. Mopkin's examination confirmed the findings of palpation, which showed a lesion on the right side of the tonsil, extending posteriorly to the posterior pillar and anterior to the anterior pillar. The vocal cords and the supraglottis and larynx and hypopharynx were normal. It was reaching up to the pharyngoepiglottic fold on the right side, and anteriorly the anterior pillar was normal. On neck examination, there was no laryngeal widening, laryngeal tenderness, laryngeal crepitus was present. There was no clinically palpable neck nodes. Systemic examination was normal. In summary, there's a 36-year-old male, right-sided throat pain with right earache, and tobacco use for the last 20 years. I had a 2.5 centimeters into 2 centimeters right tonsillar ulceroproliferative indurated lesion.
What's your diagnosis?
My differential diagnosis is squamous cell carcinoma of the right tonsil. HPV could be HPV positive or negative. Less chances of being a lymphoma or a minor salivary gland tumor.
Why have you given a differential diagnosis for this case? How would you differentiate a lymphoma from a squamous cell carcinoma?
Clinically, lymphoma may have lymph nodes, and the lesion wouldn't be ulceroproliferative. It will be mostly endophytic, and on biopsy, it will be differentiated.
No, without biopsy. Clinically?
The lesion won't be ulceroproliferative. On the lymphoma, the most common site of lymphoma in the oropharynx is tonsils, and primarily the B cell NHLs, non-Hodgkin's lymphomas. But in those cases, there will be on history there will be the constitutional symptoms, loss of weight and significant loss of weight, and history of neck swellings.
So most probably they would be submucosal and not ulceroproliferative. What about minor salivary gland tumors?
Minor salivary glands of tumors of the oropharynx of the tonsils is very rare, but it's still a possibility which can be differentiated on a biopsy.
So these cases will be submucosal. They will not present like a frank ulceration or ulceroproliferative growth. So I think if I was your examiner, I would expect a diagnosis of a squamous cell carcinoma of the right tonsil, especially with the fact of such a strong tobacco history.
Yes.
So I think that is it. Now, assuming this is a squamous cell carcinoma of the right tonsil, how will you stage this patient?
Would you put it as HPV related clinically in a person who already has tobacco habits, submucous fibrosis? As Madam mentions, the incidence of HPV-related oropharyngeal cancer is only 20%. Would you put HPV high or less likely?
I would put HPV less likely.
So Manu, in the diagnosis, you just need to say that this is a CA oropharynx and stage it appropriately. The discussion about HPV, whether it is present or not, would be completely based on biopsy. So clinical diagnosis, I think you should just give it as a CA oropharynx. So would you like to stage the patient?
Yes, ma'am. Clinically, there is no lymph nodes, and the size of the lesion is around 2.1 into 2.5 into 2 centimeters. So I would stage it as T2N0 MX lesion.
Can you talk about the staging for oropharynx cancers, T and N both?
Yes, sir. Staging for oropharynx based on the size of the lesion. It is T1 if the lesion is less than 2 centimeters. T2 2 to 4. This is HPV negative oropharyngeal squamous cell carcinomas. T2 is 2 to 4 centimeters, and T3 is more than 4 centimeters or involving the lingual surface of epiglottis. T4 is again divided into T4A and T4B. T4A is involving the larynx or the extrinsic muscles of the tongue, that is the palatoglossus, genioglossus, hyoglossus, and or involving the mandible or the hard palate. And T4B is the lesions involving the structures like the internal carotid artery, the base of skull, or yes, sir.
What about HPV positive cancers?
HPV positive cancers, there is the T1, T2, and T3 remains the same. The T4A and T4B are clubbed together for T lesions.
So there's no T4B. Everything else is T4. What about nodal staging?
Nodal staging for HPV negative oropharyngeal squamous cell carcinoma is like the head and neck, rest of the head and neck cancers, in which N1 is any lymph node metastasis which is less than 3 centimeters, N2 N2 is between 3 to 6 centimeters. N2A is single ipsilateral nodes between 3 to 6 centimeters. N2B is multiple ipsilateral nodes between 3 to 6 centimeters. N2C is bilateral or contralateral lymph nodes metastasis between 3 to 6 centimeters. N3A is any lymph node metastasis more than 6 centimeters, and N3B is any extranodal extension.
What about a 3 centimeter node, less than 3 centimeter node with extranodal extension?
That will be classified on a pathological staging as N2A.
So if it's less than 3 centimeters with N3 with ENE, it just gets upstaged 1 pathologically. Okay. What about stage grouping for HPV positive and HPV negative cancers?
HPV negative cancers, T1, all lesions, T1 N0 is stage 1. T2 N0 is stage 2. T1 T2 with N1 is stage 3. T1 T2 T3 with N0 and N1 is stage 3, and there is then classification into 4A 4C for HPV negative cancers, which is T4A stage 4A is T1 T2 T3 T4A with N1 or T4A or any of the up to T4 and with N2, and any lesion with T4A T4B with N3 is stage 4B, and any lesion with metastasis is 4C.
Good, you're doing well. Relax. You're doing quite well. Okay. So what is the difference with HPV negative positive staging?
HPV positive staging, first the end staging changes. In end staging, the N1 is any lymph node metastasis, ipsilateral or ipsilateral metastasis less than single or multiple ipsilateral metastasis less than 6 centimeters is N1. N2 is contralateral or bilateral metastasis less than 6 centimeters, or any metastasis more than 6 centimeters is N3.
Okay, good. And pathological staging?
Pathological staging, the size and the location of the lymph nodes is immaterial. Only the number of lymph nodes becomes material, and there is no N3. So N1 is less than 4 or less than 4 lymph nodes, and N2 is more than 4 lymph nodes.
Great, excellent. So what do you want to do for this patient? How will you manage this patient?
By staging is a T2 N0 M0 lesion, MX lesion. So I would want to do.
Would you call it MX or M0?
Right now, without investigation, I would put it as MX.
What does AJCC say? So the latest AJCC says that either you call it M0 or it's M+. There's no MX anymore. Okay, so if there's clinical radiological no evidence of metastasis, it's M0. So M0 or M+. Okay.
Yes, so I would do an MRI for the imaging.
Why do you want to do an MRI for this patient? So what are the various imaging modalities which you can image this patient, and give me pros and cons for each?
This patient could be imaged by a MRI or a CT or a PET CT, and MRI gives a better soft tissue delineation of in oropharyngeal cancers. So it is considered as the imaging of choice in oropharyngeal cancers. And CT gives a better visualization of the extent with respect to the bony involvement. So in advanced stages, CT can be done, and CT in MRI can have artifacts, but CT could be done, and it can be done for the chest also to see the metastasis in the same setting. So that is an advantage for CT. But the soft tissue delineation is poor in CT scans.
So, if does the plan of treatment change your imaging modality?
Ma'am, if the soft tissue extent is depending upon the if on the imaging the soft tissue extent is more than
No,
what I'm feeling.
I am seeing the patient
Yes, ma'am.
in the clinic. I see the patient and I have to order an investigation. So I don't have any investigations with me. Now, how do I decide whether I want to ask for a CT scan, MRI, or a PET scan for the patient? Or I will do all three investigations, or I'll do two investigations for a patient.
Ma'am, if on clinical examination you are sure that there is a lesion is limited to the subsite with no bony involvement, MRI would be the best choice to delineate the soft tissue extent. If the patient is staged, the patient if you on clinical examination, if you feel that the patient may have involvement of it is an advanced disease with a bony involvement, CT scan would be better. And if on the clinical examination, if you feel if there is a history of suggestive of any distant mets or lung mets, PET CT will be a better choice.
So I would put it slightly differently. When I look at the patient, I know whether this patient may be a surgical candidate or the patient is going to have to undergo upfront chemoradiation. So if the patient is the most common investigation asked for is a CT scan. And if you're planning to give chemoradiation for the patient, the radiation oncologist will also prefer a CT scan because their planning for radiation is done with a CT scan. If the patient has bony involvement, obviously you're going to get a CT scan. If you plan a surgical resection, in that case, you may want to add an MRI to a CT scan because the MRI will give you better delineation. Remember, CT scan is much faster to, it's a 64 slice CT will be done very fast. You get good information. Most of the soft tissue extent you will be able to identify there. And in terms of treatment volumes for the radiation oncologist, nothing changes more in an MRI. Unless you're suspecting, like you have a histology with adenoid cystic carcinoma and you're suspecting perineural invasion. So generally the investigation of choice for a oropharyngeal cancer, especially if you're upfront going to a non-surgical treatment, would be a CT scan. You can add on an MRI to it. That's more useful for as a surgeon to delineate what structures you are going to resect. The role of PET scan comes when
you're suspecting distant mets.
Sorry?
When you're suspecting any either a synchronous primary or a distant met.
Anything else, more commonly, where you see synchronous primaries or distant mets in less than 10% upfront. What are the other conditions where you'll ask for a PET scan? Like in most head neck squamous carcinomas, if the patient has bulky nodes, bilateral nodes, lower down nodes, lower level nodes, which increases the incidence of the patient having distant metastasis. So in these cases, or even a T4 primary where you're considering whether you want to do induction for the patient. In such a case, you may consider ruling out distant metastasis. So basically the indication is lower nodes, bulky nodes, or a very high stage tumor. In such a case, before you do definitive curative treatment, you would want to rule out distant metastasis. Okay. The incidence of upfront distant metastasis is less than 10 to 15% on presentation in most head neck cancers. So on symptoms, rarely you will get a history of distant metastasis. Okay, so now do you have any imaging of this patient?
I have a CT scan of this patient.
Okay. Can you run through the CT scan, please?
I don't have the DICOM images because he came with the CT scan.
Yes, no, can.
If, the CT scan showed a 2.5 into 2 centimeters lesion on the right side of the tonsil, extending. There was effacement of planes between the tonsil and the tongue, and it was mildly compressing the oropharyngeal airway.
Can you show the actual images once more? Okay, what, and you have biopsy proven it and shown this to be an HPV negative squamous cell carcinoma. Now, how would you manage this patient?
Ma'am, since it's a T2 lesion which is involving the oropharynx of the tonsil, only the tonsils, and mildly involving part of the soft palate, but keeping in account that the patient has trismus, I would prefer radiation therapy for this patient.
So what is the treatment of choice for HPV stage 1 to HPV negative oropharyngeal cancer?
Stage 1 to HPV negative oropharyngeal cancers do better with radiation therapies.
Do you have any data suggesting the same?
Study by Parsons et al.
Sorry?
Study by Parsons et al., which shows that that we compared a subset of patients in which the patients were treated with radiation followed by any neck dissection versus patients who were treated with upfront surgery followed by radiation. There was no difference in overall survival, but the morbidity was more in the patients who were treated with surgery.
How old is this paper?
It's in the 2000.
So it's an older paper. It's more than 10-15 years old. So as of now, there's no really head-to-head comparison of HPV negative oropharyngeal cancers. Most of them are retrospective series. What about HPV positive oropharyngeal cancers? Do you know of any data comparing stage 1, stage 2 cancers for surgery versus RT?
The recent studies like the ORATOR study, I had compared the HPV positive squamous cell carcinomas, TORS versus RT or chemoradiation.
Do you know the result of that paper? Do you know what was the primary outcome for the paper?
No, ma'am. I thought that it was on. No, ma'am.
Okay. So the ORATOR study, you're right, that was one of the a small study comparing HPV positive early stage oropharyngeal cancer for surgery, that is TORS versus RT alone or chemo RT in few cases. And the primary endpoint was not survival or loco-regional control. The primary endpoint was quality of life, swallow-related quality of life, which is by the MADADI. And though they showed that numerically, then MADADI was better in the RT arm. MADADI is the modified dysphagia inventory from MD Anderson dysphagia inventory. So they showed that though there was a difference favoring RT by the MADADI, it did not meet the pre-specified clinically meaningful difference, which they had gathered as 10 points. So there are further studies being done. So before we talk about studies and outcomes, how will you choose a patient of an early stage oropharyngeal cancer for surgery? Which are the things which you say that this patient makes it suitable for surgery?
Early stage superficial lesions of preferably the tonsils or the unilateral base of tongue with a good mouth opening, that is no onset of recent trismus.
Okay.
And patient suitable for surgery would be suitable for a transoral laser resection.
So you said one, the patient should have good mouth opening. Second, the patient should have, it should not be a deep lesion. So what do you define by deep lesion? You said it's a superficial lesion. So what is the contraindication in terms of depth for the for tonsil cancers?
Well, tonsil cancers which are extending into the if it is extending into the tongue or the soft palate.
You can resect the part of the tongue and you can resect part of the soft palate.
Which are deeply infiltrating.
So, what is the deep margin for tonsils?
The superior constrictor.
Yes. So anything which is going beyond the invading the superior constrictor, your deep margins are going to be in the parapharyngeal space, and you may not be able to resect the carotid. So the contraindication becomes when you have parapharyngeal involvement or invasion of the superior constrictors. So that is for tonsil. What about, and why not soft palate?
Patient will have nasal twang and nasal regurgitation if
exactly. So as discussed, so if they have less than 1 centimeter involvement of the soft palate, you can still offer them resection. But if you have more than 1 centimeter where you're going to resect the beyond the uvula, the patient will have very poor they'll have velopharyngeal incompetence, and the patient will have nasal regurgitation. So one is, so like you said, good mouth opening, preferably lateralized lesions, not infiltrating the superior constrictor, not involving more than 1 centimeter of the soft palate. What about the base tongue?
Base tongue also early superficial lesions.
So not a lesion involving the extrinsic muscles, which makes it T4. So superficial lesions. Anything else?
Not involving the epiglottis.
Deep infiltration of the pre-epiglottic space. So again, that makes it a contraindication because upstages the disease. What else? What about midline? Do you resect tumors crossing midline in base tongue? Why? So there are two reasons. One is that if you go across the midline, you will resect more than 50% of the base tongue mucosa. You need at least 30 to 50% of residual base tongue mucosa to have adequate swallow postoperatively. So if you're going to resect more than 50% of the base tongue mucosa, the patient will have swallowing dysfunction, which will be significant postoperatively. So that may not be worth it for the patient functionally. And second is, again, if you're crossing the midline, the chance of you damaging the opposite lingual artery is very high, and the patient may end up undergoing a total glossectomy. So these are the reasons why you would not consider doing resections which are crossing the midline for base tongue lesions. Okay. So those are your cases which you will consider suitable. And obviously, if the node is clear-cut, upfront operable. What happens if you're, one second. Oh, sorry. How do you decide between open surgery versus a transoral surgery for a patient?
Usually the subsites like tonsils are not suitable for open surgeries.
Why not? Do you know methods which will give you access to the oropharynx by open surgery?
Mandibulotomy or the midline mandibulotomy with the median glossectomy, that is the Trotter's procedure, and the pull-through procedure.
Yeah, so you can do either a mandibulotomy. Do you do which is the preferred site for mandibulotomies for oropharyngeal cancers? Do you do it median, paramedian, or ramus?
Paramedian.
Why?
To spare the inferior alveolar nerve.
Okay, and
since it's usually do for a lateralized lesions.
So you get better access and less functional disturbances when you do a paramedian mandibulotomy. Why not a pull-through approach with a lateral pharyngotomy?
For the post-operative morbidity will be worse in a pull-through approach.
In what terms?
This is in with respect to open. The lateral pharyngotomy by a pull through becomes a narrow field.
So the chances of breakdown when you do a through the neck transcervical pull through approach and a lateral pharyngotomy, unless you close the mucosa properly, most of the times you will need when you do a resection in that area, you will need either a FRAF or something to reconstruct it. Just trying to close it primarily by a primary closure may cause it to break down and you may develop orocutaneous fistulas. But the morbidity is not significantly high. In fact, compared to a mandibulotomy, it's easier and less invasive for the patient to do a oropharyngeal resection via a pull-through approach. What are the absolute contraindications for surgery for oropharyngeal cancers?
The advanced stage of the disease. T4B disease in HPV negative cancers, when it is involving the base of skull or the.
All right. If there's pre-epiglottic involvement, would you consider resection in patients?
No, ma'am. The margin will be you'll have to reach up to the hyoid.
So what surgery can you do to reach up to the hyoid?
You'll have to do a supraglotectomy.
Yeah, so you'll need to do a supraglottic resection as well. So what happens if you do a base tongue resection along with a supraglottic laryngectomy?
Firstly, the swallowing will be hampered. Then there will be high chances of aspiration.
So the more than swallowing, the patient will aspirate for a significantly longer time because the patient loses the supraglottic sensation, both base tongue as well as supraglottic you resected. But prolonged aspiration is a problem in these patients. And that's the reason why most of the times if there's significant involvement of pre-epiglottic space, surgery would not be a preferred choice of treatment for these patients. Now, if the patient is planned for radiation, when will you consider addition of chemotherapy for these patients?
Ma'am, when the staging is higher, if it is stage 3, stage 4, or the T staging is higher, that is T3, T4, or involvement of multiple nodes, we consider for chemotherapy with the radiation.
Is there any role for cetuximab with radiotherapy in patients with HPV positive oropharyngeal cancer?
2 trials were conducted, the de-escalate trial and RTOG 1016 trial. Both of them showed non-inferiority of cetuximab as compared to cisplatin. When combined with radiotherapy, increased chances of side effects and morbidity with cetuximab.
Okay, great, excellent. So let's talk about some trials. Do you know which was a seminal trial which really brought about the role of HPV in oropharyngeal cancer?
The French trial and the trial by Lian Ang.
Kian Ang. Okay, so what was the trial by Kian Ang?
In cases of HPV positive squamous cell carcinomas, he was advanced stage. He pulled from the RTOG study, he pulled up data for HPV positive and HPV negative oropharyngeal squamous cell carcinoma, which were advanced stage, and it was found that the HPV positive squamous cell carcinomas fared pretty well compared to the HPV negative in terms of disease-free survival and overall survival.
Okay, were there only 2 groups in that study? Was it a prospective study or it was a retrospective analysis?
Retrospective analysis.
It was a prospective trial on altered fractionation, but in retrospectively they looked at 522 patients in whom they had a HPV status. Not all patients had HPV status. So 522 patients, they looked at the HPV status and they did what was called a recursive partition analysis. So RPA. So this was the seminal article which divided patients with oropharyngeal cancer into 3 groups. Now, can you tell me what are those 3 groups? What you said, one is HPV positive cancers, one is HPV negative cancers, but what else did they include in it?
This HPV positive cancers who there was history of tobacco smoking.
Smoking. So how did they define smoking?
He stratified this into 3 parts. First, the low risk groups, which had a history of tobacco smoking less than 10 years, and low less T1, T2 lesions or no neck nodes. The intermediate group was patients who were advanced stage was T3, T4 or neck nodes, and the high risk group was history of smoking for more than 10 years and T3, T4 lesions and N1, N2 groups.
So I don't think it was by stage. It was more based on the HPV status and the smoking history. So they were classified into 3 groups: low, intermediate, and high risk. Low risk was HPV positive, smoking less than 10 pack years. Intermediate was HPV positive, but smoking more than 10 pack years. And high risk group was HPV negative with smoking more than 10 pack years. Okay, so this was the seminal article which actually brought about the role of HPV, and the prognosis varied from 94% to less than 70% in the patients who are HPV negative. So excellent. You are a ENT PG.
Yes.
I think you're doing really well for a ENT PG. I think you've done excellent. Great. So, sir, how much time do we have?
We have time. Carry on. Till 8 o'clock we can do it.
Okay. Because I thought you wanted to discuss something else after this.
It doesn't matter. This is important. But I just want to make one comment here, Deepa, and to Manu, that if I have a patient with trismus, then radiotherapy is not the treatment of choice for me, unless it is really P16 positive. I think this patient was P16 positive, isn't it, Manu?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
All right, then it's okay. But if this is P16 negative, and he has submucous fibrosis and trismus due to submucous fibrosis, my preference would be for surgery. And the other thing that one could discuss is what would be the impact of a positive lymph node on the treatment decision. Not on HPV positive cases. In HPV negative cases, the various factors that you discussed that would influence the treatment decision. One is, to me, trismus due to submucous fibrosis and a positive neck node, particularly if it is an N2 neck node. I would not prefer surgery in those, not prefer radiation therapy as the primary treatment. I think surgery, and surgery again, Manu, for a case of trismus, use a transoral resection, whatever, robotic or laser, whatever. With trismus, you can't do all those things very well. It has to be then an open surgery. Like Madam pointed out, a mandibulotomy and then you resected. To me, trismus due to submucous fibrosis and positive neck node for a lateralized lesion is a case for open surgery. Would you agree, Deepa?
So, my personal opinion, yes. I believe that HPV negative oropharyngeal cancer is an aggressive cancer and surgery should be one of the treatment modalities. But by evidence or in a lot of MDTs, there will be an argument against this, saying that if you are going to have positive nodes and you're treating the patient with chemoradiation, then doing surgery and then ultimately ending up giving the patient chemoradiation means that you're giving the patient trimodality treatment. So that is the argument.
But that surgery will entail a mandibulectomy. A tonsil lesion with trismus due to submucous fibrosis, will require a tonsil commander, a
Yes.
tonsil composite resection. Then he will tolerate radiation therapy well. With the mandible intact, I think they don't tolerate radiation. Certainly, they don't tolerate chemoradiation well. And who in the West has got submucous fibrosis? Those results will only come from Deepa Nair.
So I take it you heard about the trial we have proposed.
Anyway, that was the only comment I had. But
So
you have done so well that I can't let you stop. Please continue. I'm enjoying this, Deepa.
So I'm enjoying it too. It's been a long time since we've discussed oropharynx like this.
Yes, yes.
Let's talk about assessment of swallowing in these patients. How would you assess these patients for swallowing?
If there's history of any swallowing difficulty, we could try for a barium swallow or an endoscopic evaluation of swallowing or a functional endoscopic evaluation of swallowing.
So which is your preference of choice and which is the most sensitive tool to detect swallowing issues in patients?
Functional endoscopic evaluation of swallowing.
So how does, what do you mean by functional endoscopic evaluation of swallowing? Can you run me through the procedure?
The patient is, under endoscopic guidance, the patient is asked to swallow milk or any fluid, and it is evaluated based on the mobility of the oropharyngeal and the pharyngeal musculatures. And it is assessed that if there is any decreased mobility or any leakage of the fluid or any aspiration.
How do you assess mobility on fees?
Sorry, ma'am, I'm not.
So it's not mobility. So the swallowing is assessed based on two things, which is the penetration aspiration score, which is the PASS score. Have you heard of the PASS score?
Grades from 1 to 8.
Yes.
Entry into the before at the level of vocal cords and below the level of vocal cords is assessed. If there is any in grade 1, if the foreign body cannot enter into the larynx, it is expelled out. It is grade 2, it reaches up to the level of the vocal cords, and the effort is not to make to expel it out. And grade 3, it reaches up to the level of vocal cords and it is expelled out. And grade 4, it reaches up to the level of vocal cord and then to expel it out. Grade 5, it below the level of vocal cords and effort is made to expel it out. And grade 7, it reaches below the level of vocal cords and
there's aspiration. So basically you're looking at penetration where the food material enters into the larynx, but it comes out immediately. Where aspiration is where it goes below the level of the vocal cords. So, and the second thing what you use for in fees is a Yale pharyngeal residue score. So you remember this, read it up, the Yale pharyngeal residue score as well as the PASS score. These are the two things which you use in fees. Now, someone has put up in the chat box that you do a video fluoroscopic examination. So does or a modified barium swallow. So which is better, a fees or a modified barium swallow?
Ma'am, fees is better because you can record it and it gives you the aspiration as with respect also the penetration.
So both a modified barium swallow is basically a video fluoroscopic examination. You will be recording it and you will be able to see the dye going into the larynx. So so the fees is a good tool. It's a sensitive tool, but it's not very specific. And it is a bedside tool. So you can actually go to the bedside or do it in the OPD process. That's why it's a easy tool to diagnose. But the problem with the fees is that when the patient actually swallows, the second stage of swallowing is seen as a complete whiteout. So you cannot observe the second stage of swallowing in the patient because the oropharynx and the nasopharynx closes down. So there's what is called a whiteout. Whereas in a modified barium swallow or a video fluoroscopic examination, you can see the stages of swallowing. All stages of swallowing can be visually documented. So VFS is a much better tool, more accurate tool to diagnose swallowing disturbances, and also it can tell you which part of the cycle is the disturbance. So FEES is a poor tool when you're looking for oral cavity dysphagia due to oral cancers, or even for oropharynx to assess the oropharynx. It will tell you once the swallow happens, what happens. So whether there's penetration, aspiration, or there's a pharyngeal residue. But actively, it does not demonstrate it, which is what is done in a video fluoroscopic examination. But the problem with video fluoroscopic examination is you need X-rays, you need a proper machine, and most of the, very rarely it's a bedside tool. You will have to go to the patient has to go to the room where the video fluoroscopy is done. So in terms of comparison, a VFS is better to assess dysphagia problems. Do you know of any subjective or simpler assessment tools in the OPD? You've talked about FEES and you talked about VFS. But any other simpler methods to assess swallowing in the OPD which can be used as a screening tool? Have you heard of the 100 ml swallow test?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
So 100 ml swallow test is basically, again, in the OPD, you ask the patient to swallow 100 ml and see how many attempts it takes for the patient to clear it. And obviously you will look for aspiration, cough, whether the patient is clearing the throat, he's able to clear any residue in the OPD, and that gives you a gross idea of what the swallowing function is. If the patient fails or aspirates in the 100 ml swallow test, you know that this patient has severe oropharyngeal dysphagia. Great. Any other subjective measures of swallowing, which do you know of? Now, these were objective measures. Do you know if any subjective measure assessments of swallowing? We've just discussed something with the orator trial.
The Midadi.
Yes. So patient-reported outcomes or swallow questionnaires. So the Madadi is one of them. There's a Sydney swallow questionnaire, and there's swallow-related quality of life scores. So there are multiple subjective questionnaires which are patient-reported outcomes. So these are subjective assessments of swallowing. So when you need to assess swallowing or aspiration in patients, you have to do both subjective and objective outcome measures for these patients. Great. Now, do you know of the basic maneuvers which you will train patients post-operatively or post-chemoradiotherapy if they're having swallow disturbances?
On the Mendelssohn's maneuver, the supraglottic hold and the polite yawning techniques.
Okay. So most of the times for oropharyngeal cancers, what will you be asking them to do?
So Mendelssohn's maneuver.
What is the Mendelssohn maneuver?
Ma'am, you tell them to swallow with biting their tongue, like keeping the tongue in between the teeth.
I'm not sure. That is it. I thought it was the chin tuck and side tilt. But anyways, please go and read that. I may be wrong. Please go and read that. Okay. That's about swallowing. Now this patient has, for various reasons, because he has node positive or even he's P16 positive, has undergone CTRT. How will you follow up this patient?
The patients will be initially followed up for every 2 months to see for any clinical difficulty in swallowing or any for the nutritional assessment as well as the speech and swallowing assessments every 2 months for the first year, every 3 to 4 months for the next 2 years, and every 6 months for the last 2 years, for the fourth and yearly.
This is clinically. Do you do any imaging for the patient, and when?
Ma'am, if post CTRT, if the patient comes back after with any symptoms of difficulty in swallowing, or clinically if there is a lesion palpable, we'll do a swallowing after 6 months. Yeah.
6 months.
After 12 weeks, a PET CT can be done.
Why 12 weeks? Why not 8 weeks? Why not 16 weeks? Why 12 weeks?
The changes with regards to the radiation and the chemotherapy will settle down within that time frame.
So ideally, the timing of CT scan should be somewhere between 10 to 12 weeks. And that is because you want to pick up recurrences, if they, residual disease, and intervene before it is too late. But you don't want to go in early because you want to rule out, let the edema post radiotherapy settle down. So generally you time it between 10 to 12 weeks. Ideal, they've shown the maximum sensitivity and predictive value of the specificity and predictive value of PET scan is at 12 weeks. Now on when we've done the PET scan, we found this patient had, suppose this patient had an N2A node. There's response at the primary, and there's some disease or something suspicious at the neck. How would you follow this patient? What would you do? And treat both the primary and the neck? Would you treat the neck? Would you keep the neck under observation?
The primary, there is no residual in the primary. There is residual in the primary.
Tell me both conditions, what you would do.
If there is no residual in the primary and there is a suspicious node in the neck, which is there on the PET CT I've seen, we'll do an FNAC and see for any metastatic deposits.
There are no viable cells in the FNAC.
Now, if it is FNAC negative and PET CT negative, and if it is then there is a residual cells, still it has to come out. We'll do a neck dissection to.
So if it is PET negative and FNAC negative, you will still do a neck dissection if there's a small swelling present.
Ma'am, if it could be a fiber optic tissue which is harboring a metastatic deposit.
Okay. Do you know of any study which has suggested that the neck can be observed if the PET is negative after treatment for squamous cell carcinoma? What does the PET neck trial study?
Ma'am, in cases of head and neck cancers in which the primary is either treated with surgery or radiation, and the neck is observed without an upfront neck dissection, you do a PET CT and keep observing the neck.
Was it a randomized controlled trial?
Not sure, ma'am.
So the PET neck trial had two arms, where where they observed the patients who were PET negative, and they found there was no inferiority in survival in these patients. The caveat is that there were very few N3 neck nodes involved pre-treatment in this. So if you have N1 or N2A disease, which is PET negative after treatment, you can keep these patients on observation. You don't need to treat the neck with surgery, and it is non-inferior compared to doing a prophylactic neck dissection in the patients. Okay, but not for N3. Still, the standard of care is if you had an upfront N3 node, after treatment, if there's residual disease, irrespective of the PET findings, it's better to go ahead for a salvage neck dissection for those patients. What is the role of supraselective neck dissection, superselective neck dissection? Have you heard of this term?
if on the evaluations on follow-up, if you find a lymph node which is not N3 and which is less than that, you can and still if it is harboring a metastatic deposit on FNAC, you can just remove this selective node.
Do you know which group proposed this?
No, ma'am. No, ma'am.
Will you read today?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Sir, help me out, sir. I can't think of more questions. Okay, let's ask the audience. Are there any questions from the audience?
Yes, that's important. But Manu, you've done extremely well. Extremely well. I'm proud of you.
I'm very impressed, sir. For an ENT, he's done really well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
He's working with me for only a few months now.
I hope he's interested in continuing head neck, sir.
I hope so too. I hope so too. I'll have to place him with you for some time now, Deepa.
Yes, sir. He's welcome, sir.
Yes, it's a good this thing. Very, very nice. I have learned a lot today, but I'd like some of the postgraduates to ask some questions or make some comments.
Are there any questions from the postgraduates? Please speak up.
What you can do is, Deepa, you can talk a little bit about soft palate tumors while we are in the oropharynx. Tell a little bit about what influences our treatment decisions in soft palate cancers. A diffuse tumor versus a very well localized tumor. Size-wise tumors.
So I think by and large, most soft palate tumors are generally treated with upfront radiotherapy. Most of them would present actually as very small diffuse ulcerative lesions, then superficial lesions. Very rarely they will be deeply infiltrated tumors. The role of surgery upfront is if they are very superficial, they are well lateralized, not crossing the midline, or sometimes even small lesions which are just involving the uvula. You rarely get those cancers. In those cancers, you may consider upfront surgery because you'll get adequate margins and most of the musculature of the soft palate is intact. So again, the chance of nasal regurgitation and velopharyngeal incompetence is very low. But surgery is generally avoided when you have to resect the depth of the musculature of the soft palate because of the velopharyngeal incompetence. Whatever reconstruction is done by plastic surgeons, even if you put in a flap, a free flap, it's always going to be a static reconstruction and it's never dynamic. So that's the reason why soft palate surgical outcomes are much poorer unless they are superficial lesions where you can leave the depth of the deeper muscles, the tensor veli palatini, the lever veli palatini intact. So if you have that a very superficial lesion and you can excise it without resecting too much of the musculature, you can offer upfront surgery. But the other point in a soft palate cancer is that these cancers will have a high incidence of bilateral nodal metastasis. So if you're addressing them surgically, you may have to consider doing bilateral neck dissection for them. Plus, these will metastasize to the nodes of Revere, that is the retropharyngeal nodes, as your first echelon. So you have to be sure that there are no nodes in the retropharyngeal area, and you may have to consider bilateral neck dissection in these patients, which again increases morbidity for the patients. And that's one of the reasons why soft palate tumors are basically treated by radiotherapy, and you save surgery for a salvage for larger tumors. Another thing what you need to remember is when you're assessing operability for a soft palate tumor, whether it's in the perprimum stage or it's in the recurrent stage, you have to be very sure that it's only the oropharyngeal portion of the soft palate or the oral cavity side of the soft palate is involved. If there's disease going through and through into the nasopharyngeal area of the soft palate, that means your resection is going to be full thickness. You also have to look in such a case by doing a diagnostic nasal endoscopy for disease creeping up along the lateral nasopharyngeal wall, involvement of the eustachian tube. Again, you know that dissection out there is quite not risky, but yes, your margins are going to be limited because just next to the eustachian tube, you have the internal carotid artery, and anatomically, that's a challenge to get wide margins. So soft palate, you need to remember two things. One is that always do a DNE in these patients. Look for the lateral nasopharyngeal wall, look for the eustachian tube area, look for the nasopharyngeal aspect of the soft palate. And secondly, look at how the functional outcome is. If the patient is having small tumors, you can also offer brachytherapy in these patients. So superficial lesions, some in Tata hospitals, they may offer brachytherapy for these patients with reasonable outcomes for these patients. And always look for retropharyngeal nodes in these cancers. So I think one of the questions was in oropharyngeal growth, imaging first or biopsy first. I prefer to get imaging always before biopsying most patients in all sorts of malignancies, because it just gives me a better idea about where the tumor is, what is the extent of tumor, and also especially for submucosal tumors, if it's a vascular component, I don't want to end up biopsying a very vascular tumor and causing hemorrhage. I don't want to have any vessel anomalies. Especially in oropharynx, you have to be careful that you may have a retropharyngeal carotid. So knowing the anatomic positions of the vessels is very important before you do a biopsy. So imaging is preferably first for me, unless it's a very proliferative tumor and I'm just going to take some superficial biopsy where I know I'm not going deep. But as a principle, I do imaging first.
If the biopsy can be done as an outpatient procedure, then it doesn't matter. When the patient first presents, you take a biopsy which is an ulcerated growth.
Yeah, so if it's not very deep, you don't need to go in deep, then that is okay. But if it's a submucosal growth, I would always image first.
I think there was another question on the chat which is worth answering. A tonsil is extending into the retromolar trigone. What will be the treatment?
So if the tumor is extending, there's a tonsillar region, it's very less likely that you will have a primary tonsillar cancer really coming into the buccal mucosa. Most of these tumors will actually be something arising in the retromolar trigone which spreads anterior-posteriorly, because a primary tonsil crossing from the tonsil, the anterior tonsillar pillar, retromolar trigone, and then coming to the buccal mucosa is very less likely. It's more likely to be a primary retromolar trigone, and I would treat it like an oral cancer with surgery.
Yes. Any more questions? Deepa, you have been excellent. Just excellent.
Thank you. I think most of the credit goes to Manu. He did a great job.
Yes, yes. He's here with me, so I'm going to give him a pat on the back. He's just too good, too good. Very good. I was a little hesitant how well he will perform, but really he's performed superbly. Thank you very much, Deepa. I hope to have you more frequently on this.
Thank you, sir. The pleasure is all mine.
Thank you very much. I'll tell your husband when I meet him on Monday.
Sure, sir. Good night, sir. Thank you.
Good night. Good night. Thank you very much.